There is something the person who hurt you may be experiencing right now that they would never willingly confess. Something that surfaces in the quiet moments when the distractions disappear, the room goes dark, and there is no audience left to impress. You were told they never cared. You were told they moved forward without a second thought. You were made to believe that losing you meant nothing to them. And for a while, you believed it because that was the image they wanted you to see. But there is another side to what happens after the silence begins. Beneath the detached expression can exist an emotional storm they have no idea how to confront. It can be so uncomfortable and threatening to the identity they have created that they spend enormous energy hiding it, not only from you or everyone around them, but from themselves. Before we go further into the hidden emotional patterns behind narcissistic behavior, take a moment to subscribe to Narc Alert. If you have ever been manipulated, gaslit, discarded, or repeatedly made to question whether you were the problem, the purpose of this channel is to help you recognize what was actually happening. Sometimes understanding the pattern is the first step toward finally letting go of its power. The first truth is this: a narcissistic person can experience emotional consequences after hurting someone, but those emotions may not look like the remorse you were hoping to receive. They may not experience guilt in the same reflective way a healthy person does. They may not sit with genuine regret and think deeply about the pain they caused. Instead, what can emerge is something much more threatening to their psychological defenses: the feeling of being exposed. Imagine living behind an identity that depends on appearing superior, desirable, powerful, or always justified. Now imagine realizing that someone has seen behind that image. For someone who relies heavily on maintaining a carefully protected self-image, being truly seen can feel deeply threatening. This is where shame becomes important. Not the healthy kind of shame that encourages someone to recognize a mistake and make better choices, but a much deeper form of internal shame, one that can make a person desperate to escape responsibility rather than confront it. When they mistreat someone, the emotional consequences do not simply vanish because they refuse to acknowledge them. The betrayal, the harsh words, the manipulation, and the moments when they ignored another person's pain can remain psychologically uncomfortable. But instead of processing those feelings honestly, they may defend themselves against them. They may shift the blame. They may become angry. They may convince themselves that you somehow caused what happened. They may reconstruct the entire relationship until they are no longer responsible for anything. Suddenly, you become the unreasonable one. You become the unstable one. You become the person who supposedly forced them into their behavior. The story changes because accepting the original truth would require them to confront an image of themselves they desperately want to avoid. This is why their outward confidence can be misleading. They may appear charismatic, fearless, composed, and completely unaffected, but confidence that depends heavily on external validation can be surprisingly fragile. Their sense of worth may rely on attention, admiration, influence, fear, or the emotional reactions they can generate in other people. When you reacted strongly, they had evidence that they still mattered. When you argued, explained, pleaded, or tried to make them understand, they still had access to your emotional energy. But when you stopped reacting, something changed. Your silence removed a source of validation and control, and that can be deeply unsettling for someone who's become accustomed to measuring their importance through other people's responses. This is also why exposure can become such a powerful fear. They may worry that someone will eventually connect the contradictions, compare experiences, or describe the version of them that existed behind closed doors. You saw things other people may never have seen. You experienced the contradictions. You witnessed the moments when the polished image did not match the private behavior. That knowledge cannot simply be erased. So even if they appear completely comfortable afterward, they may still be concerned about what you remember, what you understand, and what you might eventually say. This is where the need for control becomes especially important. It is not necessarily about wanting the relationship back. Sometimes the deeper need is controlling the narrative surrounding its ending. They want to decide how you remember them. They want to influence how mutual friends interpret what happened. They want to determine who appears responsible and who appears wounded. And if they cannot control you directly, they may attempt to control the story surrounding you. They can present themselves as the person who tried everything. They can describe themselves as the one who was mistreated. They can portray you as unstable, unreasonable, or impossible to satisfy. The story may sound convincing because it is delivered with confidence and emotional certainty, but underneath that carefully constructed version of events can remain a truth they cannot completely escape. They know what happened. They know what they did. And sometimes maintaining the lie feels easier than facing the person they would have to become if they finally admitted the truth. The narcissist almost always chooses the emotional escape route that requires the least self-confrontation. Genuine accountability demands something they struggle deeply to tolerate: the ability to look at their own behavior without immediately defending themselves, shifting blame, attacking someone else, or rewriting the situation. Real accountability requires a stable enough sense of self to hear, "I hurt someone," without feeling that the entire identity is collapsing. For a narcissistic personality structure, admitting wrongdoing can feel much bigger than simply acknowledging a mistake. It can threaten the version of themselves they desperately need to believe. If they openly accepted the damage they caused, they would have to confront the contradiction between who they claim to be and how they actually behaved. So instead of genuine accountability, what often appears is a performance, an apology designed to end the argument, tears that arrive at exactly the right moment, promises that sound convincing but produce no lasting change, grand gestures intended to restore their position in your mind rather than repair what was damaged. And because you cared sincerely, you may have mistaken that performance for transformation. But there is a crucial difference between regret and remorse. Regret focuses on the consequences. Remorse focuses on the harm. Someone can regret losing a relationship without regretting the way they treated the person inside it. They can regret losing access to your attention, your affection, your support, your admiration, or the image they had created around the relationship. That is very different from feeling genuine concern for the emotional damage they caused. If the consequences disappeared, the regret might disappear with them. And perhaps you sensed this long before you had words for it. Their explanations told you one thing, but something inside you kept saying something did not add up. This is also why some narcissistic individuals continue watching an ex-partner long after the relationship has ended. They may check public updates, ask mutual acquaintances indirect questions, or find subtle ways to discover what is happening in your life. They may want to know whether you are struggling, whether you still talk about them, whether you found someone else, whether you are healing, whether you are happier without them. This does not automatically mean they want the relationship back. Sometimes, what they are searching for is evidence that they still occupy space in your mind. Your attention once functioned as confirmation that they mattered. When that attention disappears, they lose an external reflection of themselves, and that can be deeply uncomfortable. So they look for distractions, new relationships, new conflicts, new sources of admiration, new people to impress, new situations that keep them from sitting alone with their thoughts. But distraction can only postpone self-confrontation. Eventually, the noise becomes quiet again. And when it does, whatever they refuse to process is still waiting. That is why your healing can become so threatening to the story they created. When you were struggling, they could explain your pain in whatever way protected their self-image. They could claim you were always unstable. They could insist the relationship damaged you because something was already wrong with you. But when you become calmer, more confident, emotionally grounded, and genuinely at peace, that explanation becomes harder to maintain. Your recovery contradicts the narrative. You do not need to confront them. You do not need to prove what happened. You do not need to make them admit anything. Your life moving forward can speak more powerfully than any argument ever could, and this is where your perspective begins to change. You stop seeing them as someone who possessed unlimited power over you and begin seeing the limitations inside the world they created for themselves. Their coldness was not proof that you lacked value. Their inability to love you in a healthy way was not evidence that you were unworthy of love. You encountered wounds and defenses that existed before you entered their life. Understanding that does not excuse what happened. It simply removes the burden of believing you were responsible for fixing it. You no longer have to chase an apology. You no longer have to force an explanation. You no longer have to wait for them to finally understand your pain. Your freedom begins when their understanding stops being a requirement for your healing. And there is another fear that can be especially difficult for a narcissistic person to tolerate: becoming irrelevant. They can sometimes handle anger better than indifference. Hatred still means attention. Fear still means influence. Resentment still means emotional attachment. But being forgotten offers none of those things. They may prefer being remembered as the villain rather than realizing they no longer occupy any meaningful place in your inner world. The moment you stop checking for them, stop discussing them, stop wondering what they are doing, and stop measuring your healing against their behavior, the psychological connection begins to weaken. That is the point where your attention returns to you. And beneath the constant search for validation, some narcissistic individuals experience a profound sense of inner emptiness. They may repeatedly attempt to fill that space through admiration, relationships, status, conflict, attention, achievement, or emotional reactions from others. But external validation can temporarily distract from an internal problem without actually resolving it. That is why the search never seems to end. One source of attention is replaced by another. One relationship is followed by another. One achievement is followed by another demand for recognition. The satisfaction fades and the hunger returns. When they lose someone who provided significant emotional attention, admiration, reassurance, or validation, that loss can feel destabilizing. They may not consciously describe it as losing a source of emotional reinforcement, but their behavior can reveal the disturbance. They may become restless, more reactive, more desperate for attention. They may rush into another relationship or suddenly display an exaggerated version of how happy and successful they supposedly are. From the outside, it can look like effortless recovery, but appearances are not always evidence of emotional resolution. Sometimes what looks like moving on is simply another way of avoiding what they do not want to feel. And the emotions being avoided can be enormous. Loneliness they cannot comfortably acknowledge. Envy toward people who can form genuine connections without manipulation. Grief over the parts of themselves they never developed. Fear of genuine vulnerability. Fear of dependence. Fear of intimacy. And even fear of the softness they once criticized or punished in you. These emotions do not disappear simply because someone refuses to name them. They remain underneath the performance, waiting for the distractions to become quiet. And that is the part you no longer need to carry. Their inner conflict belongs to them. Your healing belongs to you. Whenever difficult emotions begin rising inside a narcissistic person, they may quickly transform those feelings into something that feels easier to control: anger, contempt, arrogance, irritation, superiority, or emotional distance. Instead of asking themselves, "Why am I feeling this?" they may search for someone else to blame for the discomfort. And this is important to understand. You were not the only person being manipulated inside that relationship. They were also constantly managing their own internal reality. They had to protect a particular image of themselves. They had to maintain the belief that they were strong, desirable, superior, justified, or always in control. Whenever something threatened that image, they needed a defense. And sometimes you became the target of that defense. Now pay close attention to this next part, because it explains something that can be difficult to understand after narcissistic abuse. What may disturb them most after hurting you is not necessarily the pain they caused. It can be the loss of control over how you see them. That distinction matters. They may not be lying awake replaying every moment you cried and asking themselves how they could have treated you differently. Instead, their thoughts may revolve around something much more self-focused. What does this person know about me now? Do they finally see through me? Are they telling other people what happened? Do they still believe my version of the story? Have they figured out what I spent so much time hiding? And perhaps the question that bothers them most: are they actually happy without me? Because your healing can become a direct contradiction to the story they once told themselves about you. If they convince themselves that you were weak, unstable, dependent, or incapable of moving forward without them, then watching you become calmer and stronger creates a problem for that narrative. Your recovery challenges the explanation they use to protect themselves. They may wonder whether your silence is real. They may wonder whether you genuinely stopped caring. They may wonder whether you have finally understood that the person they portrayed as powerless was actually the person capable of surviving the relationship and rebuilding afterward. And they cannot easily admit these thoughts because doing so would force them to confront uncomfortable truths. To acknowledge shame, they would have to accept that they did something shameful. To acknowledge fear, they would have to admit that their confidence was not as solid as they wanted everyone to believe. To acknowledge emptiness, they would have to recognize that external attention cannot permanently fill an internal void. And to admit that they think about you would mean accepting that you mattered. That is where everything becomes complicated, because if you mattered, then losing you mattered too. And if losing you mattered, then the relationship was not as insignificant as they claimed. So instead of confronting that reality, they may choose performance. They smile for photographs. They post about how peaceful their life has become. They emphasize how successful, happy, blessed, or unaffected they supposedly are. They may speak about you with exaggerated coldness. They may describe the relationship as though it was nothing important. They may tell mutual acquaintances that they are completely over it. They may even seem almost offended by the suggestion that they could still care. But sometimes the intensity of the performance reveals how important it is for them to maintain that image. A person who is genuinely at peace usually does not need to repeatedly convince everyone else of their peace. This does not mean every confident photograph or happy post is secretly evidence of suffering. We cannot know another person's private thoughts simply by observing their behavior. But in unhealthy relationship dynamics, excessive image management can sometimes function as a defense against uncomfortable emotions. And that brings us to the realization I want you to carry with you. The person who hurt you was not necessarily operating from the strength they displayed. Their behavior may have been driven by wounds, insecurity, fear, and defenses they had developed long before you entered their life. Instead of confronting those wounds, they may have pushed them outward. Instead of accepting responsibility for their internal struggles, they may have made you feel responsible for them. Instead of asking themselves what needed to change, they may have demanded that you change. Their cruelty was not proof that they were stronger than you. Their emotional distance was not proof that they felt nothing. Their silence was not automatically proof that they had achieved some superior level of emotional control, and their ability to appear unaffected does not determine the value of what you experienced. You have to stop measuring your reality against their performance because you were doing something very different from them. You were actually feeling what happened. You were grieving. You were questioning. You were trying to understand. You were confronting memories that hurt. You were examining your own choices. And eventually you began doing the difficult work of rebuilding yourself. That process is painful because genuine healing does not happen through pretending. You cannot simply post a picture and declare yourself healed. You cannot erase confusion by acting like it never happened. Real healing requires you to acknowledge what hurt, understand what happened, learn what you can, establish healthier boundaries, and gradually stop allowing the past to determine your future. And that is why your healing represents something meaningful. You are no longer dependent on their version of reality. You do not need them to tell you that your experience was valid. You do not need them to admit that they mistreated you before you are allowed to move forward. You do not need them to regret what happened before you can choose peace. And you certainly do not need them to become emotionally healthy before you can become healthy yourself. That is where your power begins returning to you. Not because you defeated them, not because you finally made them jealous, not because they came back, but because their behavior stopped determining your emotional direction. You stopped asking, "What are they thinking?" and slowly began asking, "What do I want for my life now?" That question changes everything. If this message has put words to something you have struggled to explain, subscribe to Narc Alert for more discussions about toxic relationship patterns, emotional manipulation, narcissistic behavior, and the process of rebuilding your sense of self after difficult relationships. And if someone you care about is still trapped in self-doubt, share this message with them. Sometimes a person does not need another person telling them what to believe. They need language for something they have already been experiencing but could never properly explain. Leave a comment with even one word describing what you are choosing now. Peace, clarity, healing, freedom, because you are not the only person who has had to find a way out of emotional confusion. There are countless people who have spent years questioning themselves because someone else repeatedly distorted their perception of reality. And one of the most important steps in recovery is learning to trust your own observations again. So let this be the moment where something changes. Stop waiting for an apology that may never come. Stop imagining that one perfect conversation will suddenly make everything make sense. Stop checking their behavior for evidence that they finally understand your pain. Stop reading every post, every silence, every new relationship, and every public display as a message meant for you. You do not need to decode them anymore. You are allowed to step outside the puzzle. Their silence does not have to remain a mystery. Their opinion does not have to remain your measuring stick. Their version of events does not have to become your reality. And their inability to acknowledge what happened does not erase what you experienced. You lived it. You felt the confusion. You remember the moments when their words and actions did not match. You remember how often you questioned yourself. You remember what it felt like to constantly search for explanations. You remember how much energy went into trying to make something work that required two emotionally responsible people. Your mind may have doubted itself afterward, but doubt does not mean your experience was false. Now you have language for patterns you once could only feel. And that language can help you create distance. You no longer have to spend every day trying to understand the person who hurt you. Their inner world is not your assignment. Their healing is not your responsibility. Their self-awareness is not something you can force. Whatever they choose to confront or avoid belongs to them. Your responsibility is to yourself, to your boundaries, to your future, to the parts of you that became quieter while you were trying to survive the relationship. to the version of yourself that deserves a life defined by stability rather than emotional chaos. So walk forward. You do not have to keep looking behind you to see whether they are watching. You do not need to prove that you are happier. You do not need to make them regret losing you. You do not need revenge. You do not need them to suffer in order for your healing to count. Your freedom becomes much more powerful when it no longer depends on what happens to them. Let them maintain whatever story makes sense to them. Let them perform whatever version of happiness they choose. Let them explain the past however they need to explain it. You are no longer required to participate in the performance because your life is no longer about proving that they were wrong. It is about discovering who you are when you are no longer living under the pressure of their expectations. You have a future ahead of you that is bigger than that relationship, bigger than the confusion, bigger than the unanswered questions, bigger than the version of yourself that spent endless nights trying to understand someone who refused to meet you with honesty and accountability. You survived the storm. You learned from it. You found your way through it. Now your purpose is not to keep studying the storm. Your purpose is to build a life where you no longer have to live inside one. And one day you may realize something even more important. The greatest proof that you healed was not that they finally understood you. It was that you finally understood yourself. And once you reach that point, their silence stops feeling like a message. Their absence stops feeling like rejection. Their opinion stops determining your worth. And the past finally becomes what it was always supposed to become. A chapter you survived, not a life sentence you have to keep reading.